Hey fellas, Meat Trapper here, and welcome to the first episode of Conibear School. Now, Conibear traps have been around for a long time, and technically they're called body grip traps because they grip the body of the animal. Conibear is sort of a popular name for them, based on the fact that Frank Conibear popularized this style trap in 1947, I believe it was, in Canada. But actual kill-style body gripping traps have been around a lot longer than that. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to refer to them as Conibears. That's what I've always called them, and old habits die hard. The important thing to remember about a Conibear trap is that it is a kill trap. When you catch something in a Conibear, more than likely it's going to be dead, and it does not discriminate. Conibear traps are becoming increasingly outlawed all across the United States, largely because of indiscriminate use and irresponsible use by a very small percentage of trappers. But all it takes is for one poodle to get caught beside a walking trail somewhere, and the death is not exactly an instantaneous death, and it makes for huge news, and it gives everybody a black eye. So if you're going to use body grip traps, make sure you know what you're doing, make sure you abide by the laws, and use common sense. Even if something's legal, it's not always a good idea. So with all of the legal mumbo jumbo and the warnings out of the way, let's start talking about some Conibears. The first thing to understand about body grip traps is they come in a wide variety of sizes, and it's very important to match the right size trap to the right size animal. The smallest commonly available body grip trap is going to be your 110, which is this trap right here. This trap is a 4-inch by 4-inch square trap, and it has one spring. Usually when the first number is a 1, it's going to be a 1 spring or a single spring trap. When the first number is a 2, it's going to have 2 springs on the trap. So a 110 is going to be your smallest commonly traps, a 4-inch by 4-inch trap. There are smaller traps. BMI makes a 55, which is I think 3.5 or 3 inches by 4 inches. I'm not sure, I'd have to check. Then there are some specialty circular body grip traps that are used for wildlife control to catch squirrels coming in and out of attics, that go as small as 2.5 inches in a circular diameter. But for common everyday trapping, the 110 is the smallest common trap, and this is a good sized trap for squirrels, muskrats, and mink, animals of that size. The next common sized body grip trap is a step up, and that is a 220, and that's this trap right here. And you can see it has 2 springs, one on each side, and this trap is a larger diameter. This is a 7-inch by 7-inch square trap. There are a number of traps in between the 110 and the 220. For instance, there is a 5 by 5 trap. In the state of Alabama, where I am, 5 by 5 is the largest body grip trap we can use on dry ground. So that law was specifically written to exclude 160 and 220 body grips from being used on land, and what it actually did is it spurred trap makers to make a slightly larger trap than a 110, and so they made a 5 by 5. After the 5 by 5, there is a 160 size trap. I don't have one here because I don't use them personally, but a 160 is a 6-inch by 6-inch trap. The 220 is a 7-inch by 7-inch. Now the next size up is a 330 trap, and a 330 is a 10-inch by 10-inch square trap, and it has 2 springs, one on each side. And this is one of the largest, if not the largest, commonly used traps. This is a dedicated beaver trap. There are very few states, I think there are only 2 states in the Union that allow a 330 on dry ground. I believe Louisiana is one, and I believe Texas is the other, but don't take me to the bank on that. But the 330, like I say, is a very large, very powerful, it's a very lethal trap. I've seen this trap used on animals as large as small hogs, and it is extremely lethal, and it's an extremely dangerous trap. This trap will hurt you. Now, there is a trap in between the 220 and the 330. It's called a 280, and that is an 8-inch by 8-inch trap. I do use a few 280s. I use them in very tight cover for beavers, but they're also an excellent otter trap. So those are the three most commonly used traps. You have your 330, you have your 220, and you have your 110. Like I say, there are a lot of sizes in between and a lot of sizes smaller and larger, but these are the three most commonly encountered traps, and that's a good idea right there of the various sizes. Now, just to give you an idea of how large some of these traps go, the trap in the foreground here is a Minnesota brand Conibear, or a 12 by 16 inch trap. It is 12 inches tall, 16 inches across. That is a massive, massive trap. You can see, compared to the 330, the 220, and the little 110, you can see just how big that is. And this trap also has dual striker bars right there. That trap is nothing to fool with, trust me. And if you really want to get serious, this is a 660 Super Bear. Compare that to the size of the Conibear, and then to the 330, the 220, and the little 110 down there. That is a big, big trap. Okay, let's talk for a minute about the parts of a body grip trap. The first thing you have are the actual striker bars themselves. This is what actually strikes the animal. It closes like a suitcase on the animal. This right here is the trigger wires. On top of the trigger wire is the dog, and you can see the dog has two notches in it, an innermost notch and an outermost notch. When deciding which one to use, that's going to be dictated by how much tension you want, and also what type of support or stabilizer that you're using, and we'll talk about the stabilizers in a later video. But all that happens really is when the animal attempts to pass through the trap, he's going to hit the trigger wires, and that's going to rotate the trigger, and that's going to throw that dog up and away, releasing the jaws. So you have the jaws of the trap, the dog, the trigger. These are the springs, and you can see those springs will pop apart, and that's what fires the trap. And this right here is the safety, and what this allows you to do, it gives you a little bit of protection in case the trap fires while you're setting it up and putting it in place. Now, the jaws are still going to strike you, but they're not going to strike you nearly as hard as if you didn't have the safety zone. Now, in a later video, we're going to talk about how to safely set and handle these traps, and you're going to see that I use a supplemental safety that goes across the top of the jaws, and I don't just rely on the built-in safeties. That's not a good idea. Finally, you need a way to fasten your trap. Don't fall into the mistake of thinking that because this is a kill trap, you don't need to securely fasten your traps. Your Belials, like this trap here, is going to come with a piece of cable attached and with a swivel. Just because this is a kill trap doesn't mean that you don't need a good piece of cable or a good piece of chain on this, and it doesn't mean that you don't need to swivel your traps. The reason being is you may catch an animal by the paw, you may catch a beaver by the tail, you may catch something by the hind leg, and it may not be fully caught, and if you don't have your trap secure, and if you don't have it well swiveled, you can lose a trap, and these are expensive traps. One of the final things that we need to discuss about the style of trap is sometimes you will see the term Magnum used to describe a body grip trap. Magnum doesn't have anything to do with the strength of the springs or how hard it hits or anything like that. A Magnum trap is a trap where the jaws close completely. You can look at this Belial and you can see there is no gap right there at all. There's a slight gap here simply because the trigger has to fit in between the two striker bars. But this trap closes completely together. A non-Magnum trap is going to have a wider gap through here. The difference and why that is important is if you were to catch something by the tail or by the paw, a Magnum style trap is going to hold that beaver. That beaver's tail is going to be caught right there. On a non-Magnum trap, that animal might escape. But on the flip side, because nothing is ever 100% good or 100% bad, if you get your thumb or your finger caught, you're caught. That's going to hold you by the thumb. Whereas on a non-Magnum trap, as long as you're not caught by the wrist or the foot or the boot or something, you have a better chance of being able to pull out and not having to do a self-rescue. So when you see Magnum, don't think bigger trap, don't think stronger springs or anything like that. It's just how tightly the jaws close. Okay, so let's talk about the different brands of traps. This is sort of the 9mm versus 45 or the Ford versus Chevy argument. It never ceases. And in reality, it's really not that important. It's just a matter of personal preference, in my opinion. For instance, Dukes are widely regarded as some of the cheaper traps that you can buy. They're roughly half the cost of a Belial trap. So one camp is going to tell you, oh, the Dukes, they catch just fine, and you know, the beavers that I catch in a Duke are just as dead as the beavers that I catch in a Belial. That's absolutely true. Then there are going to be people that are steadfast Belial believers that are going to talk about the triggers and the dogs being better. They're going to talk about the tolerances being tighter. They're going to talk about the safeties being superior. And once again, all of that is true, but it comes at twice the price. Then in the middle, there is some middle ground out there, and I recently had a very good question about this. Somebody emailed me, and Bridger has been purchased by a Minnesota brand, which makes the Mega Bear and a number of other traps. And in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with Bridger body grips. They're not quite as cheap as the Dukes, but they're not as expensive as the Belial, and they have a lot of good characteristics. Personally, I use mostly Belials. It's just the older I get, the less I want to fool with traps. I don't want to tune them and fool with them. I want to put them on the ground or put them in the water and use them. But I do keep and I do use Dukes. When I'm working in an area that may have a high probability of theft, I'd much rather lose a $20 trap than a $40 trap. So the choice is yours, but let's do this. Let's actually take a Duke 330 and let's put it side by side with a Belial 330, and let's go over the differences, and I'll show you exactly what the differences are. Okay, what we have on the bottom is a Belial 330. What we have on the Duke top is a Duke 330. The first thing you're going to notice is that the Duke is a little bit smaller trap. When you actually measure it, the Duke is going to be a 10 by 9. The Belial is a straight 10 by 10. So you get a little bit bigger trap with the Belial than you do the Duke. The next thing that is among the most obvious is the safeties. You can see the safety on a Belial stays put. Wherever I put that safety, it's going to stay. This, to me, is very important, because when you're down in the water and the light's not good and you're slipping around in the mud, when you take that safety off, you want it to stay off. And when you're submerging these traps under the water, you want to know that that safety is going to stay off. Also, when you engage that safety, you want it to stay on. You don't want it slipping off when you think you have it on. This is a very dependable, very reliable safety. I like that a lot. The next thing that you'll see on a Belial is the dog is flat. See how that's flat on top? That's a little bit easier on a pelt. There's nothing digging into a pelt because that thing is flat right there. So that takes, that's a little bit more expensive of a dog. It takes a little bit more work. It's just a nice touch. Finally, when you look at the center pin, you can see the tolerances on this trap are very tight. This is a very well made, very well put together trap. It's almost a precision instrument really. There's no wiggle, there's no play in there. You can see how tight those springs come together. Very, very nice trap. It's also a very expensive trap. Now let's take a look at the Duke. We've already mentioned that it's a little bit smaller. And you can see that dog. See, that dog is not flat. See, that's a vertical type dog. And that is going to tend to dig into a pelt more. So if you were, you know, trapping high dollar pelts, that might make a difference to you. The next thing is the triggers. You can see this trigger, see how floppy that is? That's not going to stay in place. So if I have this thing up, it might flop down, or if I flip the trap over, it can flop away. It's not gonna stay where I put it. So I have to exercise additional care when using this trap to make sure that safety is either on or off. And then when you look in here, you can see it doesn't have that same washer in the middle, and you can see there's a gap on that rivet right there. So there is more play in the jaws of this trap than on the Belial. So it is completely up to you whether or not this trap is worth twice the money that that trap is. For me, I simply don't have the time to tune and fool with traps. And what I usually find to get a Duke to behave like I want it to, I've got to do some filing on it and some tuning, whereas when I get the Belials, they're good to go right out of the box. But like I say, this trap is twice what that trap is. I do use both of them when I'm going in a place where there's a lot of sign of human activity. Maybe there are people riding by in boats, there are fishermen out there. Any place that a trap can get stolen, if I can't use a snare, because I'd much rather have them steal a snare, I'd rather lose a $20 trap than a $40 trap. So that is sort of a head-to-head comparison between a Duke and a Belial, and what the differences are, and only you can decide what's right for you. They're both good traps, they both catch fur. It just is entirely personal opinion and personal preference.